Hello, welcome to the Racial Equity in Assessments and Planning Foundational Training. My name is Artisha Hunter, and I'll be presenting with my co-facilitator, Rebecca Helprin. To make the best use of this presentation, you will need two documents: the tenant self-permission, as well as adopting and embedding a racial equity lens in community systems development. If you have not downloaded these documents yet, please do so now. There is also a document called Equity Planning Reflection Tool, which you will not need for the training, but might be useful to you in the future. Also, throughout the training, there will be opportunities for you to stop and reflect on what you've learned. So you might want something nearby to write on. And finally, I want to note that some of the following content may be triggering, particularly to people who are racialized. So please do what you need to in order to care for yourself. This racial equity in assessments and planning training is the second in a series of 7 foundational trainings that will be available to you. It will be followed by Community Systems Development Overview, Early Childhood Data and Asset Maps, Parent and Community Engagement, Workforce, and Facilities. We recognize that participants are coming from various backgrounds, and for some, the information shared today might be new, while for others, it may not be so new. For that reason, I want to stress that today's training will provide a broad overview of racial equity in the early childhood arena. It is meant to be foundational, serving as a baseline for learning. There will be a list of resources at the end of this training for those of you who want to explore more in-depth information. We have 4 objectives for today's training: to understand the importance of racial equity, practice setting group norms and expectations, establish common terminology, and explore possible next steps for embedding a racial equity lens in the Action Council work. A little bit about who we are and what we do. We are the Community Systems Statewide Supports, or CS3 team at Illinois Action for Children. We provide training and technical assistance to local early childhood collaborations and to regional councils throughout Illinois. Our aim is to ensure that local communities and regions are working to help children prenatal to 8 receive the support they need. We build the capacity of community collaborations and regional community systems to continuously improve local and regional early childhood systems. We'll be using core components of the community systems development process to support the work at the regional level. You will learn more about community systems development in Training 3. All right, before we get started, I want to share the agenda for this training. We're starting with the welcome and introduction, followed by Community Systems Statewide Supports, Self-Permission and Group Agreements, Racial Equity, the whys and definitions, Adapting and Embedding a Racial Equity Lens. We're going to do a recap and share reflections, and then we're going to also share resources. At this time, we're going to take a look at a self-permission form that is used in conjunction with the diversity-informed tenets for working with infants, children, and families, or the tenets for short, which comes out of the Irving Harris Foundation. We will not be looking at the tenets themselves, but at the self-permission form that goes along with them. We were granted permission to use this form for our work with communities, and we are happy to share it with you today, but we ask that you do not distribute it widely or use it beyond your work with your Action Council or Family Council, as it is not yet publicly available. Okay, so what is a self-permission form? Self-permission forms are used because conversations around race are hard, and many times people who have been racialized enter these conversations with many negative experiences that they are forced to live, relive, or lay bare, and or have had to defend their experiences. Oftentimes, they're exhausted from having to represent a whole racial identity in educating white people. Many times, white people enter these conversations wanting everyone to just get along and make statements such as, "I don't see color." They don't want to be uncomfortable and are sometimes afraid to say something wrong or be perceived as racist. All of this to say that these conversations are necessary, they are hard, and you will make mistakes. But Action Councils and Family Councils have to be courageous or brave spaces rather than safe spaces if we are to explicitly address some of the underlying issues that create racial inequities. Okay, now I'm going to ask you to read through the self-permission form carefully and answer the following question. What sentence or phrase stands out to you and why? Please pause this recording until you are ready to proceed. Something else that is important to productive council work is group agreements. According to this online definition, a group agreement is a clear set of guidelines on how your group will handle discussions, meetings, and sensitive information raised in the group setting. Action councils and family councils will consist of a variety of cross-sector stakeholders. Because so many different voices will need to be heard, in addition to giving self-permission, it will be important to create group agreements for how all the stakeholders agree to interact with one another, particularly around harder topics such as equity. Group agreements are a set of agreed upon expectations for how group members participate, contribute, and interact with one another. You may also have heard these called community agreements, meeting norms, group norms, or something similar. Creating group agreements is essential to having a successful and sustainable action council. Please pause this recording and take a moment to consider the following. What are some group agreements that you think are important? Writing a list might be helpful. Here are some examples of group agreements that have been used in the past from Chicago United for Equity. These are only meant to give you some ideas. We are not suggesting that you make these your council groups agreements. Listen to understand. Be transparent about who we're centering. Acknowledge your power and privilege. Assume good intent, but accept responsibility for impact. Use I statements. Hold yourself accountable for your actions. Move up, move back. We all have wisdom to bring to these conversations. And then names stay, lessons leave.
Previously, the CS3 team used to use Race Forward's definition for racial equity. Race Forward is a national organization that does race equity work. But CS3 thought it was important to come to a consensus as a team as to what racial equity means to us. Please take a moment to read through our definition of racial equity, noting anything that stands out to you. Here's another opportunity to press pause and consider the following. What would life be like if we were to achieve racial equity? We believe that when we achieve racial equity, people, including people of color, have what they need to be owners, planners, and decision makers in the systems that govern their lives. Resources, opportunities, rewards, and burdens are fairly distributed across groups and communities so that those with the greatest challenges are adequately supported and not further disadvantaged. Past and current inequities are acknowledged and accounted for, and all people, particularly those most impacted by racial inequities, are provided the infrastructure needed to thrive and participate. Systems and policies that affect children and families are consciously designed, reframed, or eliminated in a robust and dynamic process to promote greater justice. Everyone benefits from a more just, equitable system. I also want to make a note that we're aiming for the most respectful language possible, but it isn't perfect. At the time when we created this definition, we were primarily using people of color, but language is always changing and certain terms will resonate with some and not with others. You might be wondering why there needs to be a focus on racial equity. Here's a comic strip that might help bring some perspective. What is your reaction to the comic strip? What does it spark for you? Press pause and consider this. Okay, so you might wonder why focus specifically on racial equity? and not on equity as a general. Equity includes race, right? Because we can see racial inequities in almost every metric, whether it is health, education, housing, justice, et cetera, disaggregate any data, which means break data into smaller groups, and disparities are visible. It puts a focus on race and racism in all conversations. We are being explicit, not colorblind or color neutral. The more we can be focused on the problem, the more tangible the solutions are. Me as a white person, I was socialized to know that talking about race is bad or rude or racist, but we know now that that was a function of white supremacy culture. It addresses racism explicitly, but not necessarily exclusively. Race and gender, race and class, race and ability. All of these things are compounded and influence outcomes and have to do with intersectionality. We need institutional and systemic solutions. We'll touch on this later when talking about levels of racism. And racial equity must be baked into decision-making from the very beginning. Policies, programs, initiatives, proposals, they're not race blind and they were not made in a vacuum. Making a plan and then evaluating its racial equity merits afterwards, rather than building racial equity into the planning process from the beginning, will not achieve the intended outcomes. It won't get the resources needed to do the work, and it won't change institutions or structures in the long term. It may actually exacerbate inequities. If you don't build it in, it doesn't magically happen. Inequities will only continue to get worse. Talking about race doesn't narrow or limit the conversation. It actually helps deepen it. It helps people better understand the nuance and complexities of inequities. Specifically, or calling out race isn't a bad thing. In fact, explicitly talking about race is important if we want to effect change. Please pause this recording to answer the following question. What issues come to mind when you think about healthcare? And what issues come to mind when you think about healthcare and race? These are the 4 levels of racism according to Race Forward. And again, Race Forward is a national organization whose work focuses on racial equity. Internalized racism here on the left-hand side lies within individuals. These are our own private beliefs and biases about race and racism, influenced by our culture. An example is when a person believes they are more or less intelligent or beautiful than others because of their race. Then we have interpersonal racism on the right. Interpersonal racism occurs between individuals. These are biases that occur when individuals interact with others and their private racial beliefs affect their public interactions. So some examples of this are racial slurs, bigotry, hate crimes, racial violence. This is actually often what most people think about when they hear the word racism. It's easy to think that if there are no overt slurs, hate crimes, or racial violence, then there isn't any racism. But it extends way beyond interpersonal interactions. Within the systemic level, we have institutional racism, and that occurs within institutions and systems of power. It is the unfair policies and discriminatory practices of particular institutions that routinely produce racially inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people. An example is a school system that concentrates people of color in most overcrowded schools, least challenging classrooms, uses textbooks or curriculum that isn't culturally relevant, which results in higher dropout rates and lower achievement levels compared with that of white students. And then we have structural racism. Structural racism is racial bias among institutions and across society. It involves the cumulative and compounding effects of an array of societal factors, including the history, culture, ideology, and interactions of institutions and policies that systemically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. An example includes that an overwhelming number of depictions of people of color as criminals in mainstream media, which influences how various institutions and individuals treat people of color with suspicion when they are shopping, traveling, or seeking housing and employment, all of which can result in discriminatory treatment and unequal outcomes. We want to focus on systemic level racism because regardless of how we change how we interact with other individuals, institutions and systems will continue to produce inequitable outcomes if we don't aim to change those. A lot of work gets stunted at the individual level, and we want to focus on systems change, which requires looking at racism from a systemic level. Just like we can't hope to change outcomes for our children in our communities and state by focusing on individual programs, classrooms, agencies, or even the early childhood sector alone, we can't hope to change racism without looking beyond individual and interpersonal interactions to institutions and structures. We know that it can be really hard to connect what's going on at a systems level with our day-to-day work, but we actually do experience the effects of systemic racism in early childhood every day. We can see it in who does or who doesn't get services, where they receive those services, the quality of those services, and how different groups are perceived for using those services. We see it when children and families of color experience higher rates of poverty and unemployment, lack of affordable housing, food deserts, lack of mental health and health services, underfunded public schools, community violence and trauma, lack of high quality early childhood services, higher rates of discipline, suspension, and expulsion, high teacher turnover and less qualified teachers, higher rates of lead exposure and asthma, higher rates of maternal morbidity and preterm births. Research and data exists for all of these statements, and the list could go on and on. Considering all of the issues we need to address at a systems level, with systemic level racism in mind, it can feel overwhelming. So where do we even begin? We'd like to give you a moment to explore the relationship between systemic racism and access to the services families with young children need. Please pause this recording and take a few moments to answer the following questions. How has systemic racism contributed to the early childhood education and care services gap? How can reducing a region's service gap positively impact racial equity? And in what ways might reducing a region's service gap perpetuate or increase inequities?
Sometimes it could be helpful to see examples of what others have done in trying to embed racial equity within their work. So we want to provide a few examples from collaborations. A few ways you can advance equity in your work is by assessing equity efforts using the Partner Plan at Collaboration Institute's equity tool. All collaborations in the Partner Plan at Collaboration Institute complete a self-assessment tool about equity at the beginning and end of their time in a cohort. This is useful for getting a pulse check on where the group is regarding equity. Another way to advance equity is by collecting and disaggregating data, viewing data within local context and with diverse stakeholders. Disaggregating data means breaking it down into smaller groups. This can be done by race or ethnicity, income, language, age, etc. You can also engage the community to review data together with a data walk. A data walk is an interactive way for community stakeholders to have a dialogue around data findings in their community. You will learn more about data in training 4. Developing, implementing, evaluating parent and or provider surveys is where you can set targets for specific groups you want to make sure to hear from. You might want to hear from parents who are not participating in any early childhood services. When you're engaging diverse voices, translation is often a key strategy to use. So you want to ensure that you're providing surveys and using tools that are in the primary language of those you want to hear from. And then creating governance structures, policies, and procedures. This can include things like decision-making processes, revisiting mission, vision, values, roles and responsibilities, and others with a racial equity lens. To further help you think of ways that you can embed racial equity within your council work, we want to share some recommendations that were written specifically for collaborations. Those recommendations are found in this document called Adopting and Embedding a Racial Equity Lens in Community Systems Development. If you have not downloaded it yet, please do so now. When you are ready, please read the 10 recommendations on pages 5 through 6 of the document. Considering all of the issues we need to address at a systems level with systemic level racism in mind can be overwhelming. So where do we begin? Having read the 10 recommendations, we'd like to give you a moment to explore the relationship between systemic racism and access to the services families with young children need. Please pause this recording and take a moment to answer the following questions. What is one recommendation that you think it would be important for your action council or family council to implement? And what can you do to support the implementation of that recommendation?
We're nearing the end of our training, so we want to take a moment to recap everything that we've presented today. We went over the self-permissions form, looked at some group agreements, learned about CS3's definition of racial equity, learned why it's important to focus on racial equity, went over the 4 levels of racism, went through adapting and embedding a racial equity lens. Before we come to a close, we'd like to invite you to answer one last question. What is one thing from this training that you feel is important for everyone in your council to hear or learn about? Take a moment and pause this as you reflect on this. Finally, we'd like to offer some additional resources for you to explore. You will find tons of information here that will support you in learning more about racial equity. Please visit the Partner Plan Act website and explore the Racial Equity Resources tab and also the Parent Engagement Resources tab. Thank you so much for your time today.